welcome back. So we're going to start getting into modern and contemporary theory now, the kinds of things that I'm actually going to be expecting you to use in your critiques and in your papers. And we're going to begin with the class of what Abrams refers to as objective theories, right? So you may recall from our last lecture that objective theories in Abrams' categorization are those theories that are really concerned only with the relationship between the parts of the work itself, right? How the work refers to kind of things within itself. It's not interested at all in anything external, not interested in the author, not interested in the world outside, not interested in the audience, right? Just how the work itself functions. And we're going to be starting with what's called Russian formalism. So I asked you to read an article by Victor Shklovsky called Art as Technique. And we're going to be talking about Shklovsky and some of his contemporaries today. So first off, let's define what formalism is, right? Because there are other formalisms that are not Russian formalism. So formalist theory is any theory that considers the text primarily in terms of form. And what we mean by this, right, structural design and patterning, right? So if we're looking, for example, at poetry, a formalist might examine things like meter and rhyme scheme, might examine things like stanzaic patterns, alliteration, right? Features of the language or style. So you might be paying particular attention to diction, right, to particular word choices. And also genre, right? What is the kind of category of literature into which we fit this particular text? A formalist often seeks to understand what the main organizing principle of any given text is, right? What is the kind of consistent formal theme that runs through it, the formal backbone of this particular text? So we're going to talk a little bit about what Shklovsky's answers to this particular problems were. And then we will look at a group of primarily American critics who come to be called the New Critics, even though New Criticism is now almost 100 years old, who really kind of dominate mid-20th century Anglo-American criticism. And we're going to see some overlap between the Russians and the American New Critics. But I think what's going to be most interesting for us is to examine kind of where they diverge from each other. All right, so we're going to start with Shklovsky because the Russian formalists are a little bit earlier. They beat the Americans to the punch in this case. So to understand Russian formalism, and in particular to understand some of Shklovsky's arguments, it is crucial to understand the mechanical versus organic debates in literary creation as formulated by the Romantic critic Samuel Taylor Coleridge in his book Biographia Literaria. So here we have Coleridge. Oh, I didn't know this did that. And this is the 18th century critic Samuel Johnson. So a mechanical theory of literary creation suggests that a fixed pre-existing shape must be imposed upon a poem before its composition. And you may remember when we talked about neoclassicism, right? You know, the idea of decorum. That was kind of how this works. You selected a form that you thought fit your basic subject, and then you tried to work within the limitations of that form to express your particular subject. Coleridge and the Romantics argue that this is bullshit, right? No. A poem must grow naturally in the process of composition, not have a form imposed on it before it's even born, right? So for a thinker like Shklovsky and other Russian formalists, in the OAPS, which in English translates roughly, it's an acronym, I'm not sure what the Russian words are, but in English they're the Society for the Study of Poetic Language. They formed in Moscow in 1915. Members include Shklovsky, the linguist Roman Yakobson, the historian Boris Eichenbaum, Elsie Brick and Yuri Tinyanov, yeah, let's go with that, Tinyanov. And this is a group that is really kind of opposed to the idea of outside ideas imposing on literary text, on literary form, right? So they form an opposition to what is at the time the orthodox Marxist doctrine of art necessarily being a socio-political document that either tries to undermine the forces of revolution or actively supports the forces of revolution. So for this kind of argument, you might want to look at the work of the Russian writer, propagandist, political theorist Leon Trotsky, who is actually a very intelligent and sensitive critic of literature, but he is very much in that orthodox Marxist mode, right? That good literature is that which advances the cause of socialist revolution. Bad literature is that which holds it back. So the OAPS group are opposed to this doctrine. They are all eliminated or forced into exile by Joseph Stalin's regime by around the year 1930. And this here is Viktor Shklovsky, his colleague Roman Yakobson, who ends up in what becomes Czechoslovakia, and Boris Eichenbaum. Most of these guys end up finding academic careers outside of Russia. And these are some of the key texts that this group produces. We have Elsie Brick's book on sound repetitions, Shklovsky's theory of prose, Eichenbaum's theory of the formal method, and Yakobson and Tinyanov's theses on language. Like Yakobson and Tinyanov are primarily linguists. They're not as interested in literature specifically as some of the others, but they're coming from the same kind of theoretical orientation on the whole. If you want to delve a little bit more deeply into this material, you probably want to look at Shklovsky's theory of prose and Eichenbaum's theory of the formal method. Those would be the most instructive for you. So let's talk a little bit about Shklovsky's article, Art as Technique. So one of Shklovsky's first important points is that literature is artificial, right? This is one of the reasons I put the cover of one of my favorite albums up here, David Bowie's Aladdin Sane, right? Bowie, as an artist, was very much about artifice and performance and creating a persona, right? That is not necessarily the artist's authentic personality. We can also kind of trace this back to the decadents and the aestheticists of the 19th century, right? Who argued that art is supposed to be insincere. It's supposed to be artificial, right? It's a constructed object. So for Shklovsky, literature is exactly this kind of thing. It's a created object, it's artificial, it does not exist in nature. So for Shklovsky, that distinction between mechanical and organic form that we talked about a moment ago is false. There is no distinction between mechanical and organic form. Indeed, organic form for Shklovsky doesn't exist. there are no organic elements in a text's history or in its composition. It's all mechanical. It's all artificial. So in a lot of ways, he is agreeing both with the 19th century decadents who kind of follow along with some of the Romantics ideas, but he's also pulling from neoclassicism. So Yakobson, Shklowski's colleague in OAPS, argues that there is a language, a form of language, a use of language that is specifically literary in its purpose. And he calls this quality of specifically literary language literariness, right? Very great, yes. So while the purpose of ordinary practical language is simply to communicate ideas clearly and effectively, literary language constantly draws attention to itself as language, right? Not as anything else. It has no other reason to exist. It's language as art. So the formalists talk about a process that they call, because they're Russian, and this is the Russian word for it, ostranity, but which in English we call defamiliarization. So the basic theory here, and this is also something we can trace back to the Romantics. We see Wordsworth in his preface to Lyrical Ballads saying rather similar things. Habit has a deadening effect on our perception, right? The more accustomed we are to something, really the less we perceive of it, right? So what literary language, this quality of literariness does, is revitalize our view of the everyday or the mundane by making ordinary things weird, right? By making them strange. By showing us what they look like to people who aren't familiar with these things, who don't experience these things every day. And for Yakobson and for Shklowski, formal literary devices, things like metaphor, stanza forms, rhyme alliteration, any figures of speech, even the organization of plots and genres, right? All of this are means of defamiliarization, right? All of these are ways of taking mundane, everyday material and making it weird. So to give you an example of this, some of you might be familiar with this, particularly those of you who took Grid Lit 2 with me. We may have read parts of Olaud Equiano's interesting narrative. Right? So this is not a work of fiction. Right? This is an autobiography by a free black British man in the late 18th century who was captured as a child in what is now Nigeria and sold into slavery. And what Equiano does is he takes, certain objects that would have been familiar to his audiences, and he describes what they look like to someone who's never seen this before, right? So he takes I'm going to focus, for example, on the painting that he sees in his master's home in South Carolina. He's never seen a painting before, so he believes that this is some means that his master can preserve the souls of the dead to spy on him, make sure he's not doing anything he's not supposed to. He sees snow on the deck of a ship for the first time, and he believes that what he's looking at is salt, right? So he uses defamiliarization to more effectively share his experiences with readers who are totally familiar with clocks and paintings and snow, right? Who know these things to the point that we're bored with them, right? We don't care about them. They're ordinary parts of everyday existence. And